So I'm Jen Costanza. I'm in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. And Matt and I are going to kind of do two parts of this. So yeah, I'm talking first, but I guess just to jump right in. So what I'm going to talk about is kind of an overview a little bit of our recent RPA assessment. It's the 2020 version of the Resources Planning Act assessment that's done by the Forest Service. And I'll give you some background about it, but then kind of focus on the chapter of that I led, which is the chapter on disturbance to forest and rangelands, and especially talk about some of the different data sets we use. We use actually a lot of different data sets, and then show one example of how we used LANDFIRE data. And then hopefully it's of interest to the folks here is just talk a little bit about some of the products and resources we have for working with the data, and some of the publications and stuff. So not necessarily focused on LANDFIRE here, but just broad scale data sets, for example, and assessments of disturbance. And then Matt is going to jump in and talk about some aspects of this Great Basin assessment that he did. I think he has a 4-step process where he used LANDFIRE data quite a bit. And then at the end, we want to have a discussion. Obviously, there's time for a Q&A, but on our end, it'd be really interesting to brainstorm with anyone who's interested in kind of how we can make more use of LANDFIRE data sets, especially in the RPA, for example. And I have some potential ideas, but also, where can we kind of put together the information of this from these assessments with LANDFIRE, for example, to do more. And I will mention, I did see a few folks. Well, let me jump into the RPA first, and then I'll mention. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about the RPA assessment, and there are some folks on this call who were involved in that. So Matt Reeves, the other speaker, is involved, and then also Frank Koch and Kevin Potter and Karen Schleweis are also on the call. So at the end, we can all answer questions. Yeah, so this 2020 RPA assessment was released actually in 2023, so last July. It's actually the RPA program within the Forest Service releases assessments about every 10 years, and it's under a mandate from Congress from the 1970s, which mandates kind of an assessment of recent trends in forests and related resources, and then projections into the future out 50 years. So in this case, in the 2020 assessment, it was projections to 2070. And in recent assessments over the last couple decades, they've included the effects of climate change. So yes, so this 2020 assessment includes climate and socioeconomic scenarios, and we have a wealth of supporting data sets, publications, journal articles, et cetera. There's some planning guides to help land managers use RPA information, fact sheets, webinars, where each of the kind of chapter leads talks through the results of each chapter, and more. And so there's the link, and I can try to put, or someone else could too, try to put that in the chat as well. But you can find a lot there. And just, I don't want to go into this too much, but this is the kind of a future projection framework we use. So again, looking at climate and socioeconomic change. So we look at 2 levels of warming, a low and a high, kind of along the vertical axis, and then 3 levels of socioeconomic growth, which are kind of paired together to make 4 scenarios. And within each of those 4 scenarios, we use 5 global climate models. So it's a total of 20 futures. In some places, which I'm going to talk a little bit about drought, we didn't actually have a good way to incorporate the socioeconomic sides. We just have 10 futures based on future climate. But yeah, that kind of is the setup for the projections. And we use this kind of overarching framework for the entire assessment, where we have, starting from the left, the darker blue boxes, those 4 socioeconomic pathways paired with the 2 RCPs, or the climate warming levels. And those go into projections that RPA specialists make actually of county level income and population into the future under those scenarios, And also we use downscaled climate variables from the MACA data set. Those inform county level land use projections. And then we even, we have some resource specialists who downscale those to spatial realizations of land use. So at the 90-meter pixel scale, we have spatial realizations of the county level land use. And so we can do things like assess landscape pattern and then do all the things in the green that are there. Look at forest dynamics, rangeland dynamics, water, T&E species, forest fragmentation, forest product markets, outdoor recreation, and terrestrial habitats. And that's just a kind of a subset of what we do in the assessment. So definitely worth checking out. There's a lot of information. And this kind of focuses on the future trends, but again, as I said, it's congressionally mandated. We actually look at recent status and trends as well. And so here are some of the chapters. I guess these are all the main chapters in the 2020 RPA. So again, those resources that I mentioned: forest resources, products, rangelands, which is a chapter that Matt Reeves led, land resources, disturbance is a chapter that I led, water, outdoor recreation, and then wildlife and biodiversity. So zooming in on the disturbance chapter, I wanted to talk about just a few things related to that. Kind of trying to keep this pretty brief and pretty at a pretty high level, but wanted to give you all a feel for what we did in that chapter. We include forests and rangelands, which is actually rather unique compared to most of the chapters in the assessment, which focus mostly on forests, although again, Matt led the rangelands chapter as well. But it's really nice, I think, in this chapter to kind of look at disturbances across both of those kind of land use types. For fire and drought disturbances, we include recent trends and future projections. For invasive plants and insects and disease and forest removals, we look at recent trends only. And we do it for the conterminous US and then by region. The regions are there in that map. And then by ecosystem type, so forest types and rangeland ecoregions, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And then we have some case studies in the chapter on some drought impacts to forests and to economics and to rangelands, prescribed fire and sea level rise. And in the chapter for 2020, we primarily focused on exposure to disturbances. So we summarized, area burn, for example, and exposure to drought. In the future, and this is where, maybe LANDFIRE can help out, especially kind of in the recent trend realm, is we really would like to look at kind of the effects of these disturbances, or even when certain ecosystems are perhaps outside their kind of natural range of disturbance. So I think there's potential there for LANDFIRE to help a lot, LANDFIRE data. This was the first time the disturbance chapter had been included in RPA, and I think it's a really nice step forward in that direction for RPA. And then I just wanted to, I don't want to read these verbatim, but I did want to put these in here. These are kind of the key findings of this disturbance chapter. The first two are kind of on recent trends. So the annual area of fire and forests and rangelands has increased since 1984. And we're actually seeing a doubling in annual area burned over the kind of the last half of the period we looked at, 2000 to 2017 versus the first half of the period. And then the second bullet, looking at Western regions having higher exposure to fire and drought recently than Eastern regions, and the greatest rates of tree mortality caused by insects and diseases. And then forests in the South have had the highest rates of forest removals or harvest. Fire-caused tree mortality in forests in the future is expected to increase. In some scenarios, it could double. So the 108% is a doubling of fire-caused tree mortality by 2070 compared with 2020. And those rates are expected to be highest in the hotter, drier climate futures that we examined. And then drought exposure for forests and rangelands is expected to increase by 2070. In the Southwest US is expected to be particularly exposed to drought have the most substantial increases. So there's the link again where you can find the chapter. But then, yeah, so I wanted to talk about some of the data sources. And again, we used a lot of different data sources, but for the drought exposure piece, we quantified drought through a meteorological index, this SPEI index. I'd be happy to talk more about that. Won't really get into it, but it looks at precipitation and evapotranspiration. And so we summarized that for recent data and then future projections. And we overlaid that for forests. We overlaid the drought data on FIA data, FIA plot locations, and summarized those by forest types. For rangeland ecoregions, and I'll talk more about that, but that's where we use LANDFIRE data to help us out a lot to identify vegetation types and ecoregions for that analysis. On fire in the chapter, we used MTBS data to summarize recent area burned. And for future fire, we leveraged the forest dynamics model, which is a part of the RPA system, where it basically projects the forest inventory and analysis data, the FIA data, forward through time. It's kind of an imputation approach where we project future inventories based on all these global drivers and succession and disturbance and climate, et cetera. And then we were able to pull out how much volume each year was killed by fire. For non-native and invasive plants, which Kevin Potter on the call kind of led, we used information from FIA data for forests, and then from bugwood for rangelands. Insects and disease, we used the Forest Service Insects and Disease Survey data, the IDS data, and again, Kevin led that part, and forest removals or harvest. We used data from a nice attribution data set from Karen Schleweis, who's on the call. And we can talk about this more. That is one place where there isn't really being updated, that data set. So we'll be looking to other data sets to get spatial data on removals, but perhaps LANDFIRE data can help us get toward that. And I will say also the fire piece here, the recent fire assessment was led by Frank Koch, who's on the call today. So just really quick, it was a really cool way that we were able to use LANDFIRE data to define some vegetation types in terms of ecoregions on the rangeland portion of this drought assessment. On the forest side of the drought part, we used FIA data, and that's a really nice data set where we know forests and forest types are located. On the rangeland side, we really wanted some way to kind of define ecoregions, but in a more ecologically appropriate way for rangelands. And the EVT data set was really nice. The ecological vegetation type data set was a really nice way to do that. So we used 2016 LANDFIRE EVT and Forest Service ecological subsections overlaid on EVT, and then just took the majority. It's a pretty simple analysis here, but just took the majority SRM name, so from that SAF SRM field and EVT, and then some of the subsections are actually pretty small, and a lot of them had the same majority, so we could group them based on the majority EVT type. So this was a nice kind of cross between the raster EVT data and ecoregions, and it worked pretty well. So then we overlaid our drought information on each one of these, and hopefully your screen is a little bigger than my little laptop. But the point being that we could, for each one of those kind of vegetation types or ecoregions, we could get an assessment of current and then future drought exposure. And so here, the kind of dot and whisker graphs, the blues show the recent exposure. And so it's like the proportion of the vegetation in that ecoregion that was exposed to drought over a recent 30-year period under the 2 warming levels. And so the farther to the right you are, the more exposed you are to drought. And then the browns are the future scenarios. And so you can see, the browns being quite a bit higher than the blues, indicating, higher future exposure. And then we can do things like zoom in on some that actually have under, you know, under the rightmost kind of whisker there, kind of extending pretty far to the right under the higher warming level. You can see those again are in the southwest, so the southwest ecosystems or ecoregions, kind of having the highest exposure in some scenarios there. So it really did help us because we were kind of struggling with how to do this kind of simple overlay analysis in an ecological, meaningful way. And I think it worked out really well using the EBT data from LANDFIRE. So just real quick, I think this might be my last slide. Just some products that we have. We do have archived on the drought side. We have archived drought data. We have a paper actually about the forest portion of the drought assessment, also an ecosphere. And then just to say that now that we have these data sets, we've used them to inform some national forest plans in Nantahala-Pisgah National Forest and in North Carolina, and then some vulnerability assessments in the Western US in conjunction with Matt, the same kind of drought analysis and drought exposure analysis. So they've been pretty useful, the data sets and the approach, I think. So I'll turn it over, I think, to Matt now. Hopefully Megan and Matt have figured things out with audio.
So Matt's calling in.
Me now?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. We can hear you. And then do you want to take your camera off or turn your camera on?
Oh, yeah, you bet. Let me do that. See what happens here.
Yep, we got you.
Oh, good, because I can't see myself. Not that I want to, but that's all right. Yeah, so let me see if I can tinker with my screen here and get rid of all the Zoom nonsense and fit. Let's see, how about original size? Would that, ooh, that doesn't work. Hold on. For some reason, it's all jacked over. Okay, I think I got it now. Yeah, well, thanks for allowing me to talk with you today. I'm Matt Reeves. I work at the Rocky Mountain Research Station in Missoula, and I focus on non-forest issues. And, you know, LANDFIRE has been an integral part of my career ever since I started there with many of you on this call, and it seems to be ramping up even. And so I'd like to share briefly a few ideas and projects where we are using LANDFIRE to carve up the landscape into meaningful chunks in a variety of projects. One is a drought impact reporter that I partnered with Farm Services Agency to evaluate the extent of drought from our Rangeland production monitoring system, where we look at how the different vegetation types have been affected by drought and what that's meant for grazing resources around the West. And in FSA, I mean, some of those programs are worth a couple $2 billion a year. Having LANDFIRE data integral and describing to Farm Services Agency what kind of forage resources have been impacted is very useful. And when people see those maps, they understand them pretty intuitively. And most of that, most of the underlying power of the data set for LANDFIRE is, in many cases, to fill in gaps. So we use the LANDFIRE, the biophysical settings, as an example to fill in gaps where we don't have ecological sites. As you know, much of the West, I'd say, I don't know, 30% or so, plus or minus, doesn't have soil data defined. And so in order to make these kind of drought impact reports, we need a way of grouping stuff, and that's where the biophysical settings really comes in. So we target a combination of ecological sites with biophysical settings to describe drought. Another upcoming use is our of LANDFIRE is our targeted grazing decision support tool. We recently received some funding from the BILL project, by bipartisan infrastructure law, and here we take a whole bunch of different data and distill it down to where the targeted grazing opportunities might be, especially with invasive annual species. And again, in order to make sense of the environment, we're oftentimes using LANDFIRE, setting up to use LANDFIRE in this tool, where we can describe the different systems that may be in place within a given, let's say, a given ecoregion where we see targeted grazing opportunities. And so if you'd like to know more about that, let me know. But it's an interagency project, and it's one where we are trying to develop a decision support tool that won't actually prescribe exactly where things should happen, but it will give managers a briefing, a dashboard that tells them where the opportunities are legal, where they, in other words, some land we can't perform these kinds of activities, but we'll find out where it's legal, where we have the correct, environmental evaluations in place or categorical exclusions that would permit it, and where we can permit, virtual fencing, and where we see the annual grass performance in a given growing season increasing to the extent that would provide forage and therefore fuel reduction opportunities. So that's kind of the approach we're taking there. A third use that LANDFIRE data is very integral in, of course, is our surface fire behavior fuel model back in time project. We're mapping the fuels back in time from 84 to present, and we use a whole bunch of information there. We use the LANDFIRE Rangeland analysis platform. We've got data in there from our production monitoring service, and importantly, the USGS annual grass data. That's my personal favorite for all the annual grass data sets out there. The stuff by Boyd et al., in my opinion, works the best for this kind of work. And for succession and growing the fuels forward, for example, we have a fire in a shrubland, it burns, what do we do about it? How can we, grow those shrubs in time? Well, we were relying completely on the Rangeland vegetation simulator, which is developed for that purpose. But now, because of the Rangeland analysis platform, we have estimates of shrub cover we can kind of coach the vegetation simulator against, so that when a fire does occur, we can sort of, on an annual time step, assign fuel models appropriately based on the successional trajectories that are presumed to be taking place. And I'd like to pivot to the last 8 minutes of the discussion here and go a little more in depth about how we are scaling the fuel treatments and the responding or corresponding fuel models for our Westwide risk assessment that Gene Chambers and myself and many others recently conducted. And we primarily used ecological sites because that's the way that the SAGE STEP data have been bifurcated in some cases. And if you don't know the SAGE STEP project, you can look it up. It's a fantastic project that is an interagency kind of approach to evaluating fuel treatments and how they respond over time. In other words, what is the durability and the successional trajectory of these fuel treatments? They're richly measured, and they have just a treasure trove of data for people to mine and use in their land management plans and other things. Well, as you'll see in just about 3 minutes, we also rely very extensively on LANDFIRE biophysical settings to scale this kind of work to a Westwide domain. And I might talk a little bit, depending on the time we have, about our new treatment response groups, which is basically a grouping of like-kind sites where we expect the successional trajectories of fuel treatments to be about the same in terms of fuel composition and certainly with fuel quantity. Could you advance the slide, please, Jen? Yeah, thanks for doing that. The reason we wanted to do this scaling was because, Joint Fire Sciences has a pretty big stake in this, and they actually funded us to look at what the post-treatment fate of fuels might be, because we wanted to be able to suggest a landscape treatment matrix across the Great Basin to minimize fire risk. And there were many, many people on this project. All we're going to talk about today is the scaling the fuel treatments, because that's where LANDFIRE data were involved the most. Next slide, please. The first step that I like to use in conducting this work, we got a pretty well codified process for doing it. Number one, you got to get a chronosequence. In other words, how have the fuels behaved? And I don't need to go on and on about it, but we definitely leverage the SAGE step plots, and they measure those, as I said, quite regularly. We've got up to 15 years worth of data that describe chronosequence of fuels and how things progressed after a treatment. Then in step 2, we've got to have some knowledge across the landscape of the starting vegetative state. So if you're going to propose treatments, we have to know what's there to begin with, because the outcomes would be wildly different. Say if it was already cheatgrass and we prescribed some kind of treatment, well, that will be a different outcome than if it's a juniper woodland. And so we need to understand the existing state. The third step was to define off-limits areas. So areas where we don't want to treat at all. For example, desert saltbush. We don't have a lot of information about the successional trajectory of desert saltbush post-treatment. A lot of people think that most treatments might not be a good idea there. Also, areas where warm and dry on the lower end of the Wyoming sagebrush spectrum, the low R&R places. So we cross those off our list, and we don't allow treatments to occur in those places, or, in the simulations. Step 4, we need to then take this information, including the chronosequence of the fuels, and then scale them, put them on the landscape, so that we can use a program like Forces, you can Google it, which is a program that prescribes the size, the location, and the nature of the fuel treatment to best reduce risk based on all the parameters that you give it. And so that's what we did there. And then finally, you of course have to have some way of testing your assumptions to make sure they're not wild. Next slide, Jim. Okay, so just as a brief example, we have SAGE step data that have been run through a fire behavior processor here. Moisture scenarios on the X and on the Y, something called reaction intensity. Bottom line is that time starts year 0 post-treatment and goes down to year 10. We now have more data than this, but just recognize that using these types of sequences, like what happened after we treated, in this case in juniper environments, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 juniper environments, according to the control, fire treatment, and mechanical treatment. So what happened to the vegetation and the fuels and the expectant fire behavior. Next slide, Jen. Thank you. And so what we see here under the fire scenario, just as a brief example, is that this tells us that when we applied fire in the phase 1, as an example, it was the most effective at reducing the total fuels and the expected fire behavior. So this is the kind of information we use to prioritize treatments on the landscape. Next slide, Jen. And we also use the biophysical settings and existing vegetation height. We use the invasive annual grasses, again from USGS, and we use cover information from the Rangeland analysis platform. It's a Google Earth Engine asset, so it's easy to model against. And we combine all this information. It's kind of like using it's kind of like developing a LANDFIRE successional stage, let's say, but a little bit customized to the type of project we were doing. Next slide, Jen. And I mentioned the off-limits areas. So some of you are familiar with the resistance and resilience concepts from Chambers et al., starting in, say, the 2010 onwards. In this case, the red areas, just as an example, the red areas would be areas where we want to think through our treatments very carefully because they're highly susceptible to cheatgrass invasion post-treatment. Next slide, Jen. Okay, so the main use of LANDFIRE data in this case was when we overlay the SAGE step plots to get our chronosequences against ecological sites, we only get 15 million acres of coverage, the black. But when we evaluate those same SAGE step networks against biophysical settings, it enables us to paint over 150 million acres. Now, There's all kinds of debate about the usefulness and limits about physical settings versus ecological sites. I'm not here to have that discussion. I'm just saying that if you use a combination of the sites and then biophysical settings, you can really fill in a lot of gaps. And without biophysical settings, do this, we would not have been as successful in our project. Next slide, Chen. And this would just be one example, give you an idea of what the heck I'm talking about. So you overlay the Sage Step network on the ecological sites. Here's what you got for acres. So we cover 6 million acres of the loamy 8 to 10 inch precip zone ecological site as an example. And then again, if we group the sites, then go ahead and advance the slide, Jen. Yeah, if we group the sites and then scale with the biophysical settings, now we've got some real traction. So we covered 40 million acres of hypothesized successional trajectories using Intermountain Basin's big sagebrush steppe alone. So with just one biophysical setting, we completely trounced the coverage of the ecological sites. If this doesn't make sense, email me and I'll explain it more. We can talk about it at the end of the program here. Next slide, Jen. And I mentioned that we had all kinds of off-limit places that in our Great Basin project design. And the gray here are areas where it is not a sagebrush type or a PJ type. And we didn't allow treatments in any of those types for the reasons that I mentioned. So one of the upshots of this whole study, combining a lot of different data, was when you have to take into account areas you should not treat, treatable area in the Great Basin gets very small in comparison to what a lot of people might think. Next slide, Jen. And as I mentioned, one of the key pieces for LANDFIRE data was to ensure that when we are suggesting treatments, that we have the same starting point. In other words, when we're trying to expand what we found in the Sage Step plots and estimate what the trajectory might look like, successional trajectory and fuels, we have to propose the treatments where the starting point was near that was afforded by the Sage Step network. So in this case, we have two different existing vegetation types on the same site. We would not impose the same treatments, even though they're the same site, because of the existing vegetation, as you can plainly see. So this reduced our treatable area to about 35 million acres out of the whole kit and caboodle. Okay, final slide, I think, Jen. Oh, good, yes, questions for LANDFIRE. Thanks for that. I'm finished with my presentation. I know it was probably a little confusing, but it's meant to add little mustard seeds for conversation.
I was interested, Matt was talking about using state transition models in the rangeland analysis, and I was wondering, are those based on LANDFIRE models or any relationship there, or developed elsewhere?
Well, there's two answers. The first would be we use the results of the Sage Step program, the chronosequences that I mentioned, to directly infer results from a fuel treatment. So we start with a light kind site, you do your cut and leave, provided you're starting with the same existing vegetation type. And it's assumed that that general trajectory will occur based on those plots, and that covers that 15 million acres that I mentioned based on the ecological sites. So we didn't really use state and transition models there. Importantly, we also allow, it's not necessarily a direct one-to-one. In other words, if what happened in Eastern Oregon isn't exactly what will happen in Western Wyoming, let's say the sites are the same. We allow the weather to modulate the herbs accordingly, because we have seen it, with remote sensing. And when we want to project what that might look like, you can project the herbaceous response a bit more a bit better than we can the woody response because of the tools we have. That's one answer about the state and transition models. The second thing is the Rangeland Vegetation Simulator uses the biophysical settings models exclusively. And so if it's not in the BPS models, it won't be in the Rangeland Vegetation Simulator. We're coupling that with, STSIM to try and get better coverage with state and transition models through ecological sites. That'll take a bit of a push to get over that.
Thanks, Matt. I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. If it's easy for you to take that before you leave today, please go ahead and do so. You can also minimize it and get it off your screen once you're done with that. And go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, hi, Matt. Hi, Jen. Oh, let me turn my camera on. It's a quick question, because there's been a tension between ecological site descriptions and BPS since day one of LANDFIRE, way back, which you'll probably remember, Matt, from 2004. And ecological site descriptions are now considered to be complete across the country. But in a call within our CS a month or so ago, we heard that they were now trying to develop ecological site description groups, thinking that that was more akin to the scale of BPS than ecological site descriptions were. Are you aware of that effort or know anything about it?
Yeah, let's be clear about one thing. When we talk about ecological site descriptions being complete across the West, no offense to anybody, but that seems like a little bit of misrepresentation to me. It depends on how you define complete. Anyway, there is a good number of models out there in various sources of completion, I think is the correct answer, Jim. And as you know, 30 to 40% of the landscapes we might be interested in won't have any descriptions at all. Mm-hmm. So we have to be careful when we say complete. Well, with respect to the groupings, yes, the disturbance response groups that Tamsin Stringen and those folks have been championing, I think have gained quite a bit of traction. And the treatment response groups. So we have disturbance and then the resulting succession. And then we have treatment and the resulting succession. Sometimes they're similar. Our project was about the treatment response groups. So defining how similar sites might respond the same to a certain kind of disturbance or treatment. I am aware of it. It is gaining traction. They're a long ways out from putting that, for example, in something like Edit and having it available for everyone to see and use. They have a long way to go to be fully vetted there. And the purpose for grouping, I do not believe, was to make them on par or similar to biophysical settings. I think the reason they grouped is they recognized, for example, in Nevada, you might have 1,300 ecological sites, 1,200, however many there are. There's a lot of them. There's more than 1,000. And do we really need separate ecological models for each one of those when we're talking about something like wildfire? I mean, if it's a Wyoming sagebrush 8 to 10, or the Wyoming sagebrush 10 to 12 inch precip zone, do we really get a different effect from wildfire? Probably not. The sagebrush dies. So I think that was the impact there.
Yeah, I understand that. And I do agree with you. And we've actually found now that many people even want to group biophysical settings for a lot of their applications. Because they're asking a similar question. Does that the difference with the distinction or just a difference?
Well, it depends on your scale and what you're after. I wouldn't be a proponent of that personally. I think they're a pretty good mix, biophysical settings of, a little bit blurry, but useful for regional scale stuff. You'd have to think through the groupings pretty carefully. You could do it. But right now, I think for my work, especially in all the projects I mentioned, they're in a pretty good sweet spot as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks, Jim. I'm not sure which one of you mentioned the Westwide risk assessment, but can one of you speak to when it was conducted, and is there a place to go download and view the Westwide risk assessment?
Yeah, the risk assessment was recently wrapped up, I don't know, maybe 3 to 5 months ago. I don't know about a website. There's, I think, probably half a dozen publications and data sets that came out of that. For example, the treatment response groups and other things. let me get back to you on that, Megan. I have not been as involved in the outreach on that project as I should be. But
Okay, Matt, I'll put you in touch with Tom. I'll make sure you have his contact information.
Perfect.
Sean, go ahead. And you want to just introduce yourself and tell us where you're, what you do and where you are? It's always nice to have a little context.
Sure, I'm at Oregon State University, the Institute for Natural Resources, and we do a fair amount of modeling and mapping too. And I was interested in Jen's work on the RPA. Have you guys thought or looked into kind of the scales at which that could potentially be useful? You know, beyond, I know it's a national level assessment, but, you know, do you think it would be possible to use at smaller scales?
Yeah, certainly. And I can speak, there are so many facets or aspects of RPA and many of which I'm not involved in, but I can speak to the ones, related to disturbance and so forth that I had been involved in, that I've been focusing on here. So yes, specifically, I'll just say we have already used some of the results on drought, or some of even the approaches on drought and the data on drought for smaller scale assessments. So I think in general, strength of the RPA work is that, it is kind of national in scope, but many of the data sets do cover all forest lands, some cover forest and rangeland, some cover all lands. So we even look at, non-forest and non-rangeland land uses. So that's a real strength of the RPA. And I think in many cases, the results can be used at fairly local or landscape levels. But some examples on the drought, and let's see, the medicine bow. Oh man, what's the national forest, the vulnerability assessment, Matt? What were all the national forests involved in that? Sorry, I'm going to ask Matt because he was the lead on this vulnerability assessment for the name of this. But it was several national forests doing a vulnerability assessment, and they were interested in drought exposure. So that was it was still a fairly regional level analysis, but we had kind of sub ecoregions within that region where we looked at drought exposure in the exact same way that we did in the RPA as I showed for the rangeland ecosystems, but at a smaller scale. And they were able to use that in their vulnerability assessment. And so using that same drought information just with different ecoregions. And then for the Nantahala-Pisgah National Forest Plan, which is a fairly small region of Western North Carolina, essentially, we kind of zoomed in. They knew that drought was an important driver of fire activity, and they were actually using some of the LANDFIRE state and transition models to do some future projections of forest types, but we actually were able to integrate the RPA drought information into those, and then also just look at drought trends, pulling the RPA data, but looking at those trends within that national forest district. So that went into their kind of forest plan process, et cetera. So yeah, I think it definitely can be used at these smaller scales, and there's some work now to kind of coordinate within the Forest Service, between sort of RPA folks and experts who've actually done the research for RPA, and then getting it into the forest planning process in the Forest Service. So just some examples, but certainly definitely can be useful.
It was
Anyway,
Medicine Bow Route Thunder Basin.
Thank you. Medicine Bow Route Thunder Bay. Yeah, exactly. And I'll also say that, there are a few folks I think still on the call who are involved in any of these assessments. And if anyone wants to add anything, I think it will be nice to keep the conversation going on the RPA side of things, where, like I said, it's a mandate from Congress. We're already starting to think toward the 2030 assessment and how we can use LANDFIRE in future assessments would be great. And I had, one set of ideas based on kind of the BPS environmental, site potential or those kinds of layers. And could we get some metrics of how far the fire regime is maybe within or outside of, kind of the natural regime, maybe some of the fire regime layers too, but getting beyond this exposure to disturbance and looking at, sort of impacts or potential impacts would be really cool to think more about, and filling in gaps, like Matt said, where data is not available on some of these disturbances.
I'm Karen Schleweis. I work with FIA, and I've worked with LANDFIRE for 5 years as the FIA liaison. And one of the things that we brought up was we did try to look at LANDFIRE data to use for the disturbance. Essentially, RPA needed attribution classes, right? And at the time, the only operational product was, and actually still is, LANDFIRE that attributes disturbance type across the landscape. One of the reasons we couldn't use at the time was there was an abundance of unclassified disturbance types in the Southeast, which I think LANDFIRE had picked up as a kind of, maybe they would put a couple default classes over that. And I was wondering if anyone on the call kind of might know if that was implemented.
I can't think of an answer to that question, Karen, if anything has really changed from the previous years in terms of attributing disturbance type. It's very possible it has, because there have been a few changes in the disturbance mapping process, but I'm not sure they were about attributing. I would have to check on that.
Okay, yeah, I think it's probably worth us following up. Again, it's the only operational program that attributes cause. The maps that we used for the RPA were just a research product. So that is definitely a link we probably want to pursue for the RPA for the next one.
Say, Megan, there's one final thought that I did not mention.
Mm-hmm.
Another kudos here would be the LANDFIRE Reference Database. We recently worked with the LANDFIRE folks, the LANDFIRE team, to extract the species codes across all the EVTs that have been identified in the reference database. So when the user draws in the Drought Reporter, for non-forest systems, when they draw the box and they push the button, they get a list of the sites that were most impacted and the associated species from that area on that site. And it's used for managers to, within just a few minutes, begin to estimate the types of seed and the amounts of seed that they might need if they want to do some kind of revegetation effort. We employed this in 2020 with the NRCS. I got $5 million worth of seeding, seed money, no pun intended, using this technique. And so I think it works pretty well for people to get familiar with the species on their sites at a big scale. Do we need blue grama seed or blackbrush seed, or what is it that we would primarily need? And of course, there's more pieces to that puzzle, but it gives everyone a starting point.
I missed that, Matt. Was this a user interface, a web app, or a publication, or I missed?
It is. Well, it is the Drought Reporter that I mentioned in one of the first boxes when I talked about, are we down 50% or 80% in terms of forage? Yeah, I talked about it, but I didn't do a very good job connecting the dots for you. My apologies.